Following Emperor Charles's command to establish a colony, Garajas went ashore, instructing his fleet to sail along the coast. He waded through the river Montaltus, which flowed between high mountains until he reached a marshy ground where he and his men often sank up to their waist. His way in a thicket of young trees, but eventually arrived at the river Panucus. There he discovered several high walls, the ruins of fortresses, temples, and towers destroyed by Cortés, leaving the city completely desolate. 20 leagues further along the same river, Cortés had similarly plundered and destroyed Chiglia, a town that had previously housed over 20,000 houses, as well as numerous palaces, walls, towers, and temples. These acts of cruelty and looting had generated such hatred among the inhabitants towards the Spaniards that they immediately sent an army against Garajas, who had only a few malnourished men with him. Despite facing the enemy twice during his retreat to the new colony of St. Stephen, built from the ruins of Chiglia, Garajas found no provisions wherever he went. Realizing this, he decided to send his horses into the countryside to forage. However, Cortés encountered them and took the prisoners, claiming that Garajas had come to seize territory where he had not authority or right. Cortés also seized Garajus's ship and fleet, commanding him to appear in Tenochtitlan. Unable to avoid this command, Garajas obeyed. Meanwhile, his people wandered aimlessly without a leader, dying of famine or being murdered and eaten by the natives. At one point, the Americans held a grand feast with 250 roasted Spaniards. However, their days of triumph were short-lived, as Sandovalis, one of Cortés's top officers, launched a fierce attack on the cannibals, killing several thousand of them and burning 60 high-ranking individuals, all commanders, in front of their friends and relatives. As for Garajas, whose son was married to Cortés's daughter, he did not live long after the wedding, leading to murmurs that Cortés had poisoned him to rid himself of a partner in his government. It had been widely observed that his ambition tolerated no equals. The Americans all bowed down before him. They were all equal servants. His court was filled with attendants on whom he spent vast sums of money, yet his income was able to sustain such excessive expenditures. He maintained a constant payroll for 5,000 soldiers, fully equipped and prepared ships, either to keep the enslaved people in awe or for the exploration of new countries. Even after covering these extraordinary expenses, to display his wealth and greatness, he had a cannon cast entirely of solid gold. The kings who had previously acknowledged Montezuma as their sovereign provided him with an annual revenue, most of which was estimated to be worth 23 tons of gold. The king of Tezcuzcas, a magnificent city with houses plastered with white lime, paid an equal amount. From afar, the city appeared like a chalky hill or snow-covered mountain. The king of Otumba, who had taken the name Ferdinand Cortés upon his conversion to Christianity, also paid the same amount. However, others paid less. King Guacinalgo, along with his mother and some slaves, brought gold as an offering to Cortés. Upon entering the palace, they passed through a guard of 500 horsemen and 400 foot soldiers, who were always armed in readiness for fear of uprisings. Guacinalgo prostrated himself on the ground. Thus, everything exceeded whatever he could desire, hope for, or imagine. Alvaredo, one of his commanders, was sent eastward and returned with great treasures that the conquered kings were compelled to provide. But Fortune, who rarely bestows her favors for long, eventually began to frown. Cortés had sent an invaluable treasure of gold and pearls to Emperor Charles V, but it was intercepted and captured by Florin the French pirate. This deeply saddened Cortés, and for a considerable time he did not send any news or updates to the Spanish court. This led to growing suspicions and jealousy, with people doubting his intentions of making himself king over New Spain, especially fueled by his enemies. Following this, another misfortune befell him. Christopher Alettus, whom Cortés had sent to explore new lands, rebelled and took up arms against him while they were in the haven of Figueras, 500 leagues away. Despite being among a newly conquered people who undoubtedly longed for revenge, the Spaniards ignored the danger and continued with undaunted resolution. Cortés assembled a strong party and embarked on a long and arduous journey to confront Alettus, causing great destruction wherever they went. Francisco de las Casas was commanded to go on the same mission by sea and, upon arriving first, found Alettus establishing his new colony, which he named Triumph de Sancta Crux, despite the rough and turbulent waters in the Figueras haven named by the Spaniards after the trees found there, which grew at the base of the mountains and bore a fruit resembling a fig. They engaged in a battle. Casas defeated Alytus, sinking one of his ships, and then set sail again. However, they were caught in a violent storm and driven ashore, falling into Alytus's hands. Shortly before this, Alytus had also captured Aegidius or Giles Gonçalves. These two prisoners plotted how they could poison or murder Alytus, and their plans were realized as the household servants sided with them. Seizing the first opportunity during supper, they stabbed Alytus multiple times with their knives. Though the wounds were not fatal or severe enough, he managed to escape in the darkness to a nearby hut. The assassins immediately sent messengers announcing that anyone who knew where Alytus was hiding and did not bring him to them immediately. Terrified, Alytus revealed himself and was immediately beheaded during the time that the Spanish officers had these civil brawls against each other. Lodord Ponteus, a man well experienced in the law, came from Spain to America to settle everything in good order in the name of the emperor. He also had specific instructions to show great kindness to Cortés and to make him a knight of the Order of St. James, so that the emperor would be esteemed more by the proud and ambitious Mexicans, particularly the nobility. This was evident in their apparel, which was more extravagant than that of the common Americans. While the slaves went naked, except for a cloth around their privates, and carried bows and arrows before their lords, the higher-ranking individuals dressed lavishly. They wore strings of pearls around their necks and caps on their heads, from which hung 2 scarves, one longer than the other. They also wore a multicolored cotton coat that covered their bodies down to their knees, with a vest cinched around their waist. But finally, after all these services, Cortés had a disagreement with the viceroy, Don Antonio Mendoza, who was sent over at that time, and he went discontented. Section 12. Diego Gutierrez's expedition. In the year 1540, Gutierrez, having been chosen as the governor of New Carthage, set sail from Cadiz and arrived at Nombre de Dios. Upon landing, he clashed with Roderick Contreras, whom he was sent to replace. For 2 years, he made no significant progress. However, eventually reaching an agreement with Contreras, he assumed the governorship after warning Contreras not to rely too much on his authority, for the country being full of woods and mountains might hide many of his enemies. But he, not regarding the advice, went on a journey from New Granada, and having marched 50 leagues eastward, he crossed into the river Suare with 60 Spaniards, and was presented by the princes of the country with as much gold as amounted to 7,000 ducats. Here he spent some weeks, effecting little, but now all things were growing scarce, and though he was very earnest with the natives for provisions, he could get little. The kind of life the soldiers, disliking and growing weary of, went away in the night to Nicaragua. Gutierrez, thus left alone, got into a boat with intent to follow them, and being just put off from the shore, he was met by Captain Barjanto, who brought new forces and fresh provisions with him. This forced him to stay there. Not long after, Alfonso de Pisa went with 27 men from Nombre de Dios to the same river Suerte, but it being then very rough at the entrance, he was necessitated to pass on to a small uninhabited island where, whilst he lay at an anchor, the weather began to grow worse and worse. Gusts of wind, mixed with showers of rain, thunder, and lightning, seemed to threaten a general destruction. For in the ship 2 Spaniards and 1 Moor were killed by the lightning. In 72 days the sun did not shine for hours. At last, weighing anchor, he sailed over to the mainland, where he saw nothing but vast mountains and wildernesses. For a time, they lived on cockles found on the shore and wild fruits in the woods. At length, coming to Gutierrez, he sent him with his people in 5 boats to fetch the new force of Nombre de Dios. On his way, he saw a house built of canes, covered with palm leaves, 45 paces long, and built in an oval fashion. Around it stood several lesser houses that made up a village, which the Spaniards named Francisco, because they came thither on St. Francis Day. About halfway they met with the lords of Suer and Chiupa, going to attend Gutierrez, to whom, being admitted, and sitting with him at table, he gave them as a dainty gift roasted chickens and fresh pork. But they gave it to their servants, not delighting in the taste of such victuals. Gutierrez, by means of an interpreter, told them concerning the Christian religion, to which they bowed their heads without making any answer. But how little mind they had to embrace it quickly appeared, for not long after they set their villages on fire, and all the provisions that they could not carry with them they spoiled, and so retiring, they hid themselves upon inaccessible mountains. Another incentive leading them to this fight was that the governor Camachiren and his deputy, notwithstanding that he had given Gutierrez as much gold when he came first into the country, which amounted to 7,000 ducats, as we mentioned before, were put in prison by his order, contrary to all his promises. Gutierrez threatened to burn him, not regarding that he had besides received of him several pieces of gold resembling all manner of beasts, such as tigers and others, and also fishes and fowls curiously wrought, which were valued at 2 tons of gold. Yet this present seemed too little for him, whereupon, bringing the prisoner to a chest, he swore that he would roast him by degrees, if in 4 days' time he did not furnish him with 4 times as much more gold as that chest would hold, whereupon Camachiren's servants went away to get the required gold. But he, through the carelessness of the watch, made his escape in the night, so that Gutierrez lost his booty. But the other prisoners, though threatened to be torn asunder by dogs, remained firm, disowning that they had any gold, and among the rest, one speaking boldly to the Spanish officer said that he stood amazed at his treacherous dealings. Why did he keep him chained against law and promise, and often threatened him with death, but yet would not kill him, for he said he had rather choose to die than live so miserable a life. Gutierrez's conscience troubling him, he would willingly have released the Indian, and rather because he promised to procure a great ransom of gold, but the inferior commanders would not consent to it. After this they marched for 6 days through great wildernesses and over high mountains, finding no footsteps of any people. Lastly, they came down a very dangerous and steep mountain, where, had not the shrubs and jutting stones served them to hold by, they had all broken their necks. 15 leagues, the hanging of this mountain, spread itself along a sweet river, on whose opposite shore stood strange huts full of dead tigers, deer heads and legs. Here they stayed 2 days to rest themselves, where the mame trees and the cazabi plants yielded them good food. Travelling forward, Gutierrez asked an Indian which was the nearest way to a village, but he, pretending not to know any near hand, had his head immediately cut off. In like manner, and for the same reason, the Indian prince should also have been executed, had not Gutierrez given orders to the contrary. Seeing his resolution with no less patience than undaunted courage, he stretched forth his neck to the executioner. Meanwhile, with their provisions decreasing, they suffered extreme hunger, so much so that some fainted quite away. The soldiers were also rebelling against Gutierrez for food. He commanded them to kill their dogs and stamp the barks of trees. 2 days they travelled much discontented in this manner, and at last came to the entrance of a wood, where they spied an Indian standing behind a tree, which all of a sudden ran away with incredible swiftness. Early the next morning, above 4,000 Indians came marching against the faint Spaniards, making a terrible noise with horns and drums. They were all except their princes painted black and red. Some wore plumes of feathers on their heads, and collars of the same about their necks. The fight began very fiercely, by casting abundance of stones and shooting arrows, wherein, though Gutierrez was at first wounded, yet after half an hour the assailants fled, but recruited with fresh forces renewed the fights, breaking into their ranks, and making so great slaughter amongst them with wooden swords and palm tree clubs, knocking down and dealing such deadly wounds, that of the Spaniards 3 only escaped, saving themselves by flight, who 2 hours after, much amazed and terrified, came to their reserve, consisting only of 24 men, which Alfonso de Risa commanded, insulting enemy at their heels, waving over their heads the swords, shields, and crossbows which they had gotten from the slain Spaniards, and some withal crying in the Spanish tongue, "Come, Christians, come and take gold." But de Risa, for all their pride, set them going with some volleys of shot. After this, escaping innumerable other dangers, he came to Nombre de Dios without having effected anything of note. In the city of Panama, in New Spain, lived 3 eminent Spaniards, called Francisco Pizarro, Diego de Almagro, and Ferdinand de Luc, a priest who jointly designed to discover farther southerly along the rich gold and pearl coasts and inspect the Southern Ocean. De Luque was to look after home affairs, and Pizarro set sail first with a ship manned by 114 men, which Almagro followed with 70 more. Yet both were valiantly repulsed by the Peruvians, but although they returned the first time with bad success, yet they undertook their business once more, but with no better fortune, whereupon, discouraged, the undertaking seemed to be totally laid aside, and the American viceroy, Peter de Rios, forbade anyone to attempt a further discovery concerning Peru. The former difficulties with this edict easily influenced Pizarro's men, all but 12, to leave him. The rest went over with the ship fitted out by Rios with supplies to the island Gallo, where Pizarro resided, had also failed in his second expedition. But although he had made 2 unsuccessful voyages, having an inclination for a third attempt, he went to Spain desiring from the emperor to be the governor of Peru, which he had discovered. Besides his plea of merits, he had taken possession of the country twice by landing there, intended for the use of his imperial majesty. Seaman, for that purpose, brandished his 2-handed sword over his head, the gleam of which so frightened the natives that none of them dared to come near him. His request, after consultation, was finally granted, and the government of Peru was conferred upon him, but Almagro took it very badly that Pizarro went to the emperor on such a design for himself. Yet, by the mediation of his friends, the difference was reconciled. Then Pizarro set sail with 150 foot soldiers besides horses, and landing at the island of Puna, he was initially courteously entertained, but the Spaniards, by extravagantly hunting and searching everywhere, including their houses for gold and committing several other outrages, incensed and changed the mood of the inhabitants so much that they attacked them. Instead of ensigns, standards, and warlike trophies, they used long canes, at the ends of which were tied the bones of their ancient heroes, honored by them after their deaths. But these relics did not save the Indians from slaughter as well as the cover of a neighboring wood. From this isle, lying 3 degrees southward of the equator, Pizarro passed over to the main continent, where they were all in great confusion upon hearing of the Spaniards' cruelties committed in Puna. Yet all the preparations the Indians made to withstand did not stop Pizarro from his intended course. First, having succeeded in mastering Tampez, he thought nothing of marching his forces over the river Ambato, where they burned a temple dedicated to the sun. The portico faced east, facing the rising of their god, before which hung a curtain of their fine cotton fabric. Representations of 2 golden rams shaded with black, and as many dragons, before which the fire never went out, continually supplied with offerings of burnt incense. On the pillars hung several men flayed, their flesh kept firm and free from all putrefaction. With the infusion of a sharp juice, Almagro came to Pizarro with fresh forces, and they made no little penetration into Peru, satisfying everywhere their thirst for gold and slaughtering the toothless. Tombeses, a people who, having offended their king, had by his order the upper teeth of the whole nation beaten out. Peter Alvarado, informed concerning the riches of Peru and well knowing how to ingratiate himself with the emperor in his fawning letters, finally prevailed by his friend's influence, and he also got permission to go there. In pursuit of this, in the year 1534, he weighed anchor with 7 ships from Guatemala, a city built by him between 2 mountains. But landing at Puerto Viejo and marching easterly over snowy mountains, he was met by Almagro, between whom a bloody encounter was likely to have happened. But after some time, a treaty being initiated, they reached a settlement on these terms, that Alvarado, upon receipt of 100,000 ducats, should leave his men with Almagro and depart from Peru. With this sum being enriched, he soon afterward outfitted 14 ships to discover new countries to the west. However, while busy with his preparations, he was summoned to Mexico by Don Antonio Mendoza, the viceroy, to undertake a voyage with him to the newly discovered country of Cibola, abounding in gold and saffron, according to the report of 4 Dominican monks. Having already raised 700 men, news arrived in Mexico that Peter Zúñiga had suffered a defeat by the Indians of Jalisco. Alvarado marched with all speed to his assistance and found the Indians encamped on a high mountain, fortified with intertwined trees and large stones tied together, with rushes behind which they were secure from shots. The Spaniards climbed up the mountain, approaching their works, when suddenly the defenders gave a great shout and cut the cords that held their fortification together. As a result, the stones and trees tumbled down with such force that they killed both men and horses, with few escaping alive. This conflict, Alvarado himself was lost. His wife, Beatrix Cuova, held a grand funeral for her husband and had her house painted black, refusing to eat or drink for a set time. However, despite her pretense of sorrow, she focused so much on her business that she took control of the government of Guatemala. But her rule did not last long, for on the 18th of September in the year 1541, a hideous tempest of wind and rain, mixed with continual lightning and horrible claps of thunder, occurred and was answered with roars and terrifying bellowings from the caverns of the mountain at whose foot Guatemala stood. Around midnight the mountain erupted, giving birth to a flooding river, a precipitous torrent rushing down full of rocks and stones that carried everything before it. Within a few minutes, Guatemala was completely swept away, with no trace remaining, and no one left alive except Alvarado's bastard daughter by an Indian. In the adjacent fields, a few people survived, albeit injured with broken arms or legs. After this utter destruction, another Guatemala was rebuilt 3 leagues further eastward. This will conclude Chapter 7. Stay tuned for Chapter 8, and thank you for lending me your ear.